So the brain has four main parts. When you look at it superficially, you're only going to see three. Diencephalon is buried within the cerebrum. Okay. We'll talk about each one, but we have the brainstem, the diencephalon, the cerebrum, which is what you think of as the brain, and the cerebellum, which is that extra little part that sits in the bottom and the back. The brainstem is sort of the link between the spinal cord and the rest of the brain. The spinal cord is continuous, meaning there is not a clean break between them. You have the spinal cord coming up, and then you'll have the brainstem, and then the brainstem will blend into the brain itself. It's all a smooth process going from the brain down the spinal cord. The brainstem has multiple parts, including the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain, which we'll talk about. So this is the cross-section of the brain. And so when you think of the brain, you are thinking of the cerebrum. The cerebellum is this part that sits down here, and it looks definitely separate from the rest. Okay? It's a different color, it's a different texture, it sits in its own little pocket, essentially, in the skull. The spinal cord is coming from down here, and then you can see this is spinal cord, and that is medulla oblongata. So medulla oblongata is part of the brain stem, but there is no line here telling you where one stops and the other starts, right? Like I said, the spinal cord just merges into the medulla oblongata, and then we have the pons, medulla oblongata and the pons, and then the midbrain. And it's all just kind of one big structure. Okay? Structurally, it's more or less one thing, but they have different purposes. So that's why they're broken down into different things. And then the diencephalon is this region here. It's buried in the center. It sits at the top of the brainstem. And so you can imagine, in an intact brain, you can't see the diencephalon. Yeah.
Is it the little egg-shaped thing?
It is this whole area here. So under the white part, so it's the white part and everything here, but down to the midbrain. So the midbrain is spinal, is brainstem. In reality, it doesn't look nearly as nice as that. If the brain looked like that, brain surgery would be a lot easier. But it doesn't. It looks like that. And so it's not nearly as easy to find individual structures in a real brain as it is in a diagram. You will be using diagrams and models that look more like that. We won't have a real brain. Well, we do have real brains, but not in lab. First thing we're going to talk about in terms of structure of the brain is cerebrospinal fluid. We talked about CSF and we talked about the spinal cord. It is the same thing, and the flow of the CSF is more or less continuous between them. It is one supply of cerebrospinal fluid that goes in between them, and it's more or less going to be gravity fed. The majority of it's going to be made up in your brain, and then gravity is going to work it down through parts of your brain into your spinal cord and down your spinal cord. It has a number of purposes. One, it's going to be physical protection. So our brain has a lot of cerebrospinal fluid around it. Why do you think that is a protection mechanism? It's a cushion, yeah. If every time I moved my head around, the brain inside my skull whacked against the bone, that wouldn't be a good thing. We would get a concussion just by looking to the side. Same idea with the spinal cord. Spinal cord isn't as big, it's not as heavy, so it's not going to be bouncing around as much. But what's the spinal cord going to do that your brain is not going to do in terms of movement? It's going to move and bend, right? And so our brain is not going to bend. But every time you bend your spine, you're bending your spinal cord. It's also going to act as a chemical barrier. It's going to protect your brain and your spinal cord from chemicals. Imagine you have something near your spinal cord that's going to produce some acid. If that acid goes directly onto your spinal cord, that's not going to be good. But if that acid gets diluted into the cerebrospinal fluid, then the acid is not nearly as strong. Cerebrospinal fluid is going to have a buffer in it. We said buffers prevent pH changes, right? It's also going to work to take chemicals. Imagine things like cellular metabolites, things that get made as a cell is just using energy, toxic chemicals that need to get moved away. It's like putting things into a drain or a flowing stream of water. It's going to get carried away and hopefully into a less dangerous area. CSF is clear. It's basically just water with some things dissolved in it. There's going to be some oxygen, glucose, and then other chemicals like the buffers and things. It's essentially blood plasma. That's more or less what CSF is blood plasma. And so it's going to be in the subarachnoid space. Where is the subarachnoid space? Below the arachnoid mater and above the pia mater, right? And so we have cera mater, arachnoid mater, pia mater. CSF is going to be primarily below the arachnoid mater in the subarachnoid space, in both the brain and the spinal cord. Remember, both the brain and the spinal cord have the same meninges, those same connective layers. Yeah.
So, just so I make sure I remember this right, the arachnoid and the pia mater and the other ones, they're the ones that cover the spinal cord and all that.
Correct.
Okay.
Yes.
Just want to make sure.
So in the spinal cord, it was very neat. It was just one after another after another. In the brain, it's not going to be quite as neat. The subarachnoid space on the brain is much larger than it is around the spinal cord. There's also some big cavities that are going to store this CSF. And when we do this lab, there's going to be a model specifically of these cavities. They're essentially big open spaces in your brain that contain a whole bunch of CSF. They're essentially the reservoirs for the CSF, and then it gets moved out of the reservoirs through a big system down your spinal cord, and it's going to get reabsorbed. So there are 4 of these ventricles, two lateral ventricles. One is called the third ventricle and the fourth ventricle. These are those ventricles. Remember, just a ventricle is just a big open space. Okay? And so there are 2 lateral ventricles, one on each side. And then just below, these come together here. And then just below that is a little opening, a little open space, the third ventricle. And then further down is the fourth ventricle. So really, these are the first and the second, but we don't call them the first and the second. They are both lateral ventricles. The CSF is made by something called the choroid plexus. And this is plural because there are choroid plexuses in each of those ventricles. At the base, at the bottom, of each of those ventricles is a layer of cells that more or less just filters blood, keeps the blood cells in big molecules like proteins in the blood, and allows the plasma through. The plasma comes through and becomes the CSF. So it's made in these ventricles. They're the reservoir, the holding area for them, and then it comes out of those through a big system of ducts. So on our brain, like I said, we still have the same three meninges: dura, arachnoid, and pia. Now that I'm looking, I don't like it. We'll find a better picture of it. The brainstem, we said, is more or less the connection between the spinal cord and the diencephalon. It is the top of the spinal cord, and we said that there are three parts to it: medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. Medulla oblongata has two nuclei. Remember we said a nuclei, or a nucleus, is a bundle of neurons. So in the medulla oblongata, there are two bundles of neurons that have different functions. And they're very, very, very important functions. Medulla oblongata is going to control your heart and your blood vessels in the cardiovascular center. And it's also going to have the respiratory center, which is going to control your lungs. So those are two very, very important processes in your body. They are the primary purpose of the medulla oblongata. So the medulla oblongata has nothing to do with how ornery you are. It does not affect orneriness or orneriosity or whatever you want to say. It does not make alligators ornery.
Dude, what are you talking about?
Water boy.
Oh, hi. Okay.
Medulla oblongata, this is a very important part of the brain, which has two very important parts and makes a fantastic exam question. Hmm? What was I thinking? That doesn't fit there. I don't know. We'll see if we come back to it. So the midbrain sits above medulla oblongata. Remember, we had the brain stem coming up, and then we had kind of a little bit of bulge, and then a big bulge, and then a little one, and then the diencephalon was up here with the cerebrum up here. And so that was medulla. The midbrain is actually up here, and that was pons. So the midbrain connects the pons to the diencephalon. And the midbrain has two nuclei. There's the red nuclei, which are red because they have a whole bunch of blood in them, is going to control a lot of muscular movements. And so it is more of the voluntary muscular movements. We're going to see another part of the brain controls more of the posture and the coordination movements. This is going to be more of the voluntary movement. The other nucleus is the substantia nigra. They're very large, they're very dark. Rather than being red, they're very dark, almost black or dark purple. And if you lose function of substantia nigra, you develop Parkinson's disease. And so while we don't know exactly what causes Parkinson's disease, it's very clear that it's very closely related to the substantia nigra. That it's a failure of the substantia nigra. The question is, why is it failure? Yeah.
So I know like neurons and stuff, you can't replace those. Is that the same thing with these nuclei? Like once they're done, you can't replace them?
Nuclei are bundles of neurons.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
And so exactly. That's why if you have brain damage, there's very little that we can do. Essentially, the improvement that you see in people after brain damage is your brain finding a workaround. It's not healing itself. The brain's not able to heal. It can find a different way to do something. So, all you need to get out of this is there are two nuclei, right? There are the red ones, and then there are the darker substantia nigra. You won't, in the lab, we won't have a model that's this zoomed in. You won't see parts of the midbrain. You'll see something like that. So the midbrain, because it is the connection between the spinal cord and the diencephalon, there's going to be a lot of information going through that. Because you have everything up here is the brain, where all of these decisions are being made. But the brain doesn't actually do anything, right? It has no effector function. So every decision that it makes, every command that it gives is going to have to go through the midbrain. And every sensation that we have that's going to the brain for it to make the decision is going to have to go through the midbrain. And so it's going to act sort of as a traffic cop. Some information can come up here and go from the midbrain into parts of the brain, parts of the cerebrum up here, or it can pass some of the information onto the diencephalon, which is a very specialized part of the brain, which can really take these different sensors and send them into specific parts of the cerebrum up here. Diencephalon has multiple parts also. The thalamus, hypothalamus, and the pineal gland. The thalamus is going to be another one of these relay stations. It's going to receive a lot of information from the midbrain. It's going to come from the midbrain into the thalamus, and it's going to pass that on to the cerebrum. And so the midbrain can tease out some information and say, well, I know where this is supposed to go. I'm going to send it directly there. But the majority of the information that goes through the midbrain, it's going to pass on to the thalamus, which is really then going to deliver it in the finely tuned little areas in the cerebrum. The hypothalamus controls the autonomic nervous system that we'll talk about more in depth at the end of the lecture. Remember, the autonomic nervous system is the involuntary portion of the brain. The pineal gland is a tiny little gland in the diencephalon, and it makes melatonin. Does anybody know anything about melatonin? It makes you sleepy. Do you know why it makes you sleepy? Well, I'm going to back up. So sleep is a part of our normal life, right? We have awake parts of our day. We have asleep parts of our day. And even if you've done nothing all day, if it gets to be bedtime, you get tired. And even if you really need more sleep, and it gets to be getting up time in the morning, a lot of people will have trouble sleeping, right? Why? You know you have to get up. Is that what you said? Yeah. So imagine it's the weekend, it's homecoming, is this Santa Fe Friday on?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, it's Friday, it's a holiday. You don't actually have to get up. But time your alarm clock normally goes off comes and you just can't sleep. Why? Circadian rhythm. Yeah. Our brain has a biological clock too. It knows what time it is. If you were locked in a room with no windows all day, you would have an idea of what time it was. And you would kind of around your normal bedtime, you would get sleepy. And when the sun came up the next morning, even though you couldn't see it, you would get less sleepy. You would start to wake up. Circadian rhythm is controlled by our brain and is primarily controlled by melatonin. And so high melatonin makes you sleepy. And so your brain, around bedtime, starts secreting melatonin. Later at night, when it's getting closer to morning, you stop secreting the melatonin. And so your melatonin levels will drop, you're not as sleepy anymore, and so you wake up. And so a lot of people who have trouble sleeping will actually take melatonin. I've never tried it, but people, when I've heard, it seems to work fairly well.
But after you take it, you wake up and you really big headache.
I hate.
I haven't heard that.
My wife takes
Every
it.
time I can't take
I
it, because I get headaches.
I can't sleep when I take that.
It keeps you from sleeping.
I feel sick.
I don't know what's that.
Nah, I just don't take it.
Benadryl will knock you out. It's not a natural thing like melatonin. So this is another look at our brain. So we said the diencephalon is this big white arch and all of this area underneath it. Okay? So the white arch is called the corpus callosum. We'll learn that in the lab. You're not responsible for that in lecture though. But it's, to me, it's a fantastic landmark for finding things. You look at that and you immediately see that and say, well, then everything below that is my diencephalon. And then once I find diencephalon, because of this, I look for that dot. That dot is very prominent in this diagram, and on the models in lab, it's going to be a bump. It's going to be easy to find. The thing, the egg-shaped structure with the dot or the bump on it is the thalamus. Yeah.
Is the whole thing the thalamus, or is it just the cute little dot?
It's the whole egg-shaped structure with the dot. And then the hypothalamus is the area just below the thalamus. Hypo always means low or below. So the hypothalamus is just below the thalamus. The pineal gland is this little thing just behind the thalamus. Diencephalon is three parts: thalamus with the dot or the bump, hypothalamus just below it, and the pineal gland, which is just behind it. Moving on up. Next is the cerebellum. So the cerebellum is this back here. It looks almost like an extra little mini brain back there. And it does almost function independently of the rest of the brain. It has two hemispheres, meaning there's a left and a right. We haven't talked about the cerebrum yet, but the cerebrum also has two halves, left and right brain, which you already knew. You may not have been able to put it into words of there are two hemispheres, but you knew there were left and right brains, right? Cerebellum is the same. There's two hemispheres. Think of hemispheres of the earth, right? It's half of the earth. Cerebellum controls coordination. That's another very, very nice exam question. Coordination is a very important process, and it's very easy to pin it on one part of the brain, cerebellum.
Is that why the cerebellum is such a major part, because coordination is such a major part of
Yeah,
function?
yeah. So it's not just, when we think of coordination, we think not being klutzy. But when you think about what would go into that, all of the different things that have to go in to me moving from here to there, all of the cooperation that has to go into that, all of that cooperation is controlled by the cerebellum. It has a few parts on its own. There's the cerebral cortex. Oh, sorry. We're already done with the cerebellum. Moving on all the way up. Cerebrum has multiple parts. There's the cerebral cortex, which is just at the very outer edge of the cerebrum. That is gray matter. When you picture the brain, people always call it the gray matter. Picture the brain, you see pictures of the brain, it is gray. But actually only the outside, the outermost layer is gray. Because that's where the gray matter is, and that's the cerebral cortex. Under that is a large region of cerebral white matter. And then there are gray matter nuclei also. So what's the difference between white matter and gray matter? Myelin. Myelin. And if something has myelin, what do you think that tells you about the function of that part of the brain?
Faster.
It's a pass, exactly. Myelin, remember, helps conduct signals. And so an area that has myelin is more or less a pass-through, whereas things that are gray matter are the end of the line. They're going to receive information, make a decision, turn it around, and send it back the other way. And so imagine information coming from my senses.
Oh, yeah. I'll just get it all.
Coming up spinal cord, through the brainstem, into the diencephalon, into the cerebrum, and then working all the way up to the top, then a decision is going to get made. And it's going to turn around and come back down. The cerebrum is going to allow us to have the higher level thinking. If you take an animal that you think of as not a very smart animal, most likely they're going to have pretty much the same level of brainstem and cerebellum activity in the diencephalon also that we have. It's going to be the cerebrum that is going to separate them. And in particular, it's going to be the cerebral cortex. Cerebral cortex is where long-term memory happens. And so if you take an animal, even an animal that you think of as more of an intelligent animal, they're not going to have the best long-term memory for massive amounts of information, right? Think of a dog. You can teach a dog a fair amount. But unless you absolutely ingrain that into them, they're not going to remember it, right? If they see something once, unless it's like a traumatic or dramatic experience, they're not going to remember it. But hopefully, I tell you this once, and it's in there, right? Or at least it only takes a couple times to go through it. And we can hold a whole lot of information up there. And so that allows each individual person to remember a whole bunch of stuff. It's also then going to allow us to pass that information on. And so if you think about it, in terms of a civilization, a tiny little amount of extra memory from one species to another over thousands and millions of years can lead to a huge buildup of information and knowledge. simply because we have a larger cerebral cortex, and so I remember just a little bit more than my ancestors. And my children know just a little bit more. But after a whole bunch of generations, our knowledge as a race gets really big. Somebody, did you have a question?
Long-term memories in the cerebral cortex.
Cerebral cortex.
Okay.
Yes. Cerebrum itself is kind of interesting looking. That wrinkled picture of a brain that you picture is the cerebrum. And there are a lot of landmarks, and all those folds and things have names. And so the folds themselves are called gyri. The singular form is just gyrus. That's a U. Singular form is gyrus. Plural is gyri. The grooves on the brain are called fissures. And then the shallow little grooves, almost like valleys, are called sulci. Singular is sulcus. So there's one sulcus or multiple sulci. So when you look at this, so here is the surface view, and here it's cut a little more. And so these lumps, the hills, are the gyri. The little valleys between them are the sulci, and then the fissures are very, very large grooves. They're very deep. That actually folds down in here. So you can see the gyrus is the fold, the sulcus is the little valley created by the folds, but then a fissure is very, very deep. So the primary fissure here is the longitudinal fissure. That's what separates the left brain from the right brain. It actually continues all the way down into the brain, right into the diencephalon. The central sulcus is going to separate two lobes of the brain, the frontal and the parietal lobe. The central sulcus is this line here. It's not incredibly easy to find, but if you look at the other sulci around it, there isn't a nice one that goes all the way from the edge to the longitudinal fissure. And you see how this one goes all the way across, and the others don't. In the lab, most likely for a lab exam, where you're asked to find the central sulcus, the brain will actually be different colors like that. And so you see, well, there's a color change there. So it's going to draw your eyes right to that central sulcus. The gyri on either side of that are called the precentral and postcentral gyrus. Precentral is just in front of the central sulcus. Postcentral is just behind it. And so if you find the central sulcus, you found the other two. The pre is just in front, post is just behind it. Easy enough. So we have a number of lobes in the brain. In the front, behind what bone do you think? The frontal bone. Behind what muscle? The frontalis is the frontal lobe. What bone was in the back? Occipital bone. That covers up the occipital lobe. parietal, temporal. Basically the same name as the bones, right? So those are fairly easy to find. And again, if you were asked which lobe is this sticker on a model, that model is going to be color-coded, showing you where the divisions are. And so you're not like, well, which one is this in? It's going to be clear it's in that one. And then you just have to know which one is that in. Which name is that? Cerebellum is considered a lobe of the brain down here. And then there is another one covered up here called the insula. That's a lobe of the brain. It's just not visible from the outside. And so you may see a picture in your book or online where they've taken a little tool and they've kind of pulled back part of the temporal lobe, and then you can see the insula down in there. That is review and extra information. The functions that you need to know for each part are the functions that are specifically told to you in the PowerPoint. Okay? You don't have to know functions that are listed here that are not in bullet points of the PowerPoint. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Because the brain is incredibly complicated, and if you had to memorize all of the functions of all the lobes and all of that stuff, you would be a neurosurgeon by the time you finish. And that's not our goal. So, the cranial nerves are nerves that come out of our brain and then go into different parts of our body to control different functions of our body. And there are 12 pairs of cranial nerves, and they are part of the peripheral nervous system. Now, first of all, why do you immediately know that they are part of the peripheral nervous system? Say it again?
Part of the brain.
They're coming out of the brain, and so we have two parts of the nervous system, peripheral and think structural, central. You have the central and the peripheral. What is the central nervous system? There are only two parts to it, brain and spinal cord. This is coming out of the brain, but it is not part of the brain. And so it is part of the peripheral nervous system. Now there are 12 pairs. Why do you think they are all pairs? Two sides to
Oh, two sides of the body.
yeah. There are two sides of the body, which includes the brain, right? And so there are two sides. There are two sides of the brain. Each side is going to put out an identical cranial nerve, and each one is going to control half of your body. Each cranial nerve has a name and a Roman numeral. Some of these nerves are sensory only, meaning they're only going to carry information to the brain. Some of them are motor only, meaning they're only going to carry information from the brain. But the majority of them are two-way streets. They're going to carry information to the brain and back. They are the main communication route from the brain to a part of the body. And it's going to go in both directions. So these cranial nerves are going to come from multiple places in the brain. There's not just one little area where they all come from. It's based on what their function is. It's going to determine what part of the brain they attach to. So cranial nerve 1 is also called the olfactory nerve. Its function is to run your nose. And so it comes to the nose and it connects in the front of your brain, very close to your nose. The eyes the ear, they have their own cranial nerves, and so they're going to connect at more or less the closest part of the brain to those organs. The spinal cord is going to have some that come out of it also. Cranial nerves 1, 2, and 5, 6, 7, 8, 1, 2, and 8 are sensory only. There are 5 of them that are motor only, and 4 that have control of both. So you're going to want to know 12, are they sensory, motor, or mixed?
Four was mixed.
There are 4 that are mixed. So Roman numerals are here. We talked about the olfactory. The only other cranial nerve that I really want you to know what its function is the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve is number 10. And it actually more or less controls your internal organs. If you have a major internal organ located in this area, most likely it is controlled by the vagus nerve, number 10. All of the other ones are very specialized. We'll talk about some of them. We talk about the special senses. Like we'll talk about the cranial nerves that's specifically for your eyes and the olfactory in your ears. But the vagus nerve is going to control things like your intestines, your stomach, your lungs. Yeah, go ahead.
So is the vagus nerve spelled like Vegas?
It is vagus with an A. V-A-G-U-S. So actually, the vagus nerve, the way it controls your lungs is actually controlling the diaphragm. When you have hiccups, it's actually a spasm of the diaphragm caused by random, more or less random firing of the vagus nerve. Let's take a break. We'll come back at 1:15 on that clock.
Nick.
I just took a break.
Thursday, but where? In the library or? I'm making like a whole message on Canvas whenever I get my computer out one day. Alright, I'm going outside for a minute.
So I would sit over here.
You think we're distracted? I'm not sure.
What?
We have a lab.
Yes.
What part of the muscle system? The outer or the inner?
Let us say leg.
Well, that opens it up to the bottom.
Hold on.
Bones or muscles?
Muscles.
Muscles.
So it's the hardest of them, but it's only one. And so there's a lot of parts of the body that you don't have to carry. That makes sense. If I told you the arm is very easy,
Yeah.
and so I can't tell you it's not gonna be the arm. So you can, for the quiz, you can ignore the arm and the back and the front and all that stuff. Just focus on the leg.
The thigh of the cat. Upper leg or lower leg?
All.
That's neat. Oh, well.
Yeah, I can't remember. Elliot. Where's he at? Oh. He just said we're doing, and Latin, for the grade. Oh, it's this one. I know we're the first page, so, but that's as much as I, the first page of this. Got it on Alice.
So we're allowed today after ordering the quiz, we're just going to do.
Yes, and hopefully the one extra skin.
There's so many marks.
But it's more or less.
I'm gonna head in my lab looking at all the questions.
What, this?
Yes. I was trying to get ahead because I feel like I'm falling back and, so I went and got ahead.
That's good.
It was just the questions though, cause like I feel like I don't have enough time in lab to like answer the question and let alone do the hands-on work.
It's very rushed, and
Yes, I hate it.
the second half is going to be, I'm afraid, worse.
Oh, no. That's
Remember,
great.
this is my first time teaching this particular course, and if you look at the schedule, the majority of the weeks have 2 labs associated with it.
Yeah.
And so I'm gonna have to go through and do a lot of
That's why I
crossing out. And
Yeah.
it's not ideal, because it's not an organized process, right?
Right.
It makes it very herky-jerky, nobody knows what's going on.
skip this, do
Thanks,
this,
Irma.
skip this.
Right. Well, that's not even Irma, unless Irma was the person who made the schedule. But
What are the odds?
Yeah,
right.
That would be pretty.
it's just,
We all agree.
it's just,
Then I need to
it
find
seems
out.
to me that there are too many labs, or that the labs they have are too big. My guess is that the people who've done this for years and years, they know what parts to do. Whereas we get a lab manual that should take 2 semesters to finish, and it's like, you got 1 week to do this. You got 1 week to do that.
Yeah, it's crazy. That's why I'm glad they have open lab.
So like, is this to be math, mainstream school?
We'll see.
Who's not on there?
Which is, you all wanted that to be, and you all would have gotten on the high. it's a layer. I mean, to me, covering is
So it's not-
protective.
Oh, okay, so it's a layer, it's not necessarily a covering. Because I was thinking it was more like a covering and not like a
It is the outermost portion of the brain. That,
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
imagine a very simple brain
Yeah.
that kind of grew a little bit and added extra storage space.
Okay, that makes sense.
Can't bribe me, Francis.
What? No bragging, there's one that one bragging.
Don't even, I had the right answer, and I changed it because I was like,
Me too. What'd you have for the first one?
well, I got the first one right.
I had both of these and I think.
To what? There was no ego on the side. I'm so mad I changed it. Don't even get it.
Me too.
Yeah, we didn't.
I thought it was a different one.
We didn't Snickers and all these like quick. You're not you on your own.
Oh my god. Is it king size or not? Deal breaker.
Okay.
I'll let you take
But it's 2 squares.
You do realize you're on like recording here, trying to not
It doesn't get good on.
bribe someone, right?
I'm just trying. It's hard on the streets.
The streets.
I get cold at
You were a little baby winter, what streets?
The realest streets in the mall.
You're the streets of the
Okay.
I just stepped back in like right now.
Oh.
Oh, I have another thing. So just to make perfectly sure, we don't need a Scantron for the lecture test.
The only thing you need a Scantron for is the lecture final exam.
Hold on. Just so I don't freak out on Tuesday and I'm like, oh, shoot.
I'm so mad.
Yeah, Thursday.
Beforehand.
It's not true. That is not true.
Taylor.
So the next few slides are just review of the 12 cranial nerves. And so vagus is number 10 here. Internal organs. another very nice example. Because it's a very, very important nerve that controls a lot of things. Whereas if you go through some of the other ones, they're very, very specialized. Like the hypoglossal nerve controls the tongue. That's not. Right?
Right.
The vagus nerve controls a whole bunch of really important stuff. Okay. So now we're going to move on to more or less the autonomic nervous system. And the autonomic nervous system is, number one, it's the involuntary part. And it's, to me, it's a very interesting thing. I'm not really a big brain person, but to me, the autonomic nervous system is an interesting thing. Because it's involuntary, it works without us thinking, and there's these, like I mentioned last week, there's two parts, and they're constantly battling each other to figure out who's going to control an organ at any given point in time. The autonomic nervous system is primarily controlled by the hypothalamus. This bullet says, from the book, says hypothalamus and brainstem. Hypothalamus is by far, in my mind, more important than brainstem. Somebody asks you what part of the brain controls the autonomic nervous system, they're looking for hypothalamus. Okay. The brainstem is there because medulla oblongata is there. Medulla oblongata is in the brainstem. We said that controls respiratory and the heart, but the hypothalamus plays a bigger role than the brain, than medulla oblongata. So, autonomic nervous system, which we learned earlier, has two parts, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. Most organs are controlled by both. And if they're controlled by both, that is called dual innervation. Innervation is a nerve coming into something. So this is dual innervated because there are nerves coming into it from the sympathetic and parasympathetic division. For the most part, if there's dual innervation, they're going to be at odds with each other. One is going to try to speed something up, and the other is going to try to slow it down. That is not always the case. There are just a few examples where they cooperate. But that is not what when you think dual innervation, you should think two opposite processes working against each other. The autonomic nervous system is going to be controlling things in our body through spinal nerves. Spinal nerves are going to come off of the spinal cord. And so here we have a nerve coming off the spinal cord, and because this is a motor neuron, we learned last week that the motor neurons attach to the front of the spinal cord. And so this is attached to the front. It is sending a signal to skeletal muscle. In this case, skeletal muscle is an effector. An effector is the thing that actually carries out a command. In this case, this is a motor neuron. This is just an example of the somatic nervous system. This is not the autonomic nervous. This is the somatic nervous system. Things that make our muscles move. Okay? Down here, we have three examples of how this works in the autonomic nervous system. Up here, the nerve went straight from the spinal cord to the effector. It was a direct connection. In the autonomic nervous system, it is not a direct connection. It is going to be a one-stop connection. It's going to be one layover. So in this case, there are two nerves. There's going to be a nerve from the spinal cord to the layover, and then a second nerve from the layover to the effector. In this case, the layover is a ganglion. It's the autonomic nervous system, and so the ganglion is called an autonomic ganglion. The nerve before the ganglion is the preganglionic neuron. The neuron before the ganglion, so it's preganglionic. The one after is the postganglionic neuron. Yeah.
What's the ganglion again?
It's a bundle of nerves.
Oh,
So in the peripheral nervous system, a bundle of nerves is a ganglion. In the brain, in the central nervous system, it's a what? Nucleus.
That's why I was confused, because I know you said before that it was
Yeah.
nuclear, and I was right.
It's just they use different terms, whether it's central or peripheral.
Okay.
Here, we have a layover. The layover, though, is a gland. And so we have a preganglionic neuron going to the adrenal gland, and then there is no postganglionic neuron. The second leg of the trip is a hormone. The adrenal gland makes hormones. So there's a preganglionic neuron that tells the adrenal gland to make hormones, which then go someplace else and have an effect. Down here, we have a third type. These two were sympathetic. So in the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, you can have these two methods. The parasympathetic division only has one method. And this is the two-neuron method. Again. But there's something different. If you look at this one and that one, what is different? Look at the picture, don't worry about the words. That is exactly the difference. Yes, thank you. In the sympathetic, the preganglionic is short, the postganglionic is long. In the parasympathetic, the preganglionic is long, and the postganglionic is short. So what that works out to mean is that for the sympathetic system, these ganglions are going to be right next to the spinal cord. We're going to see that. They're lined up on right down either side of your spinal cord. So the preganglionic neuron comes out of the spinal cord into the first layover very quickly, and then there's a long shot to whatever the effector is, whether it's a muscle or a blood vessel or wherever it's going. In the parasympathetic division, though, the ganglion is actually right next to the effector. And so you're going to have to go a long ways to get from the spinal cord to the ganglion, and then it's just a little hop, skip, and a jump from there over to the effector. Sympathetic division can also be called thoracolumbar because it comes from the thoracic and lumbar parts of the spinal cord. Don't worry about that name. If you see it someplace else, that can help you figure what they're talking about. But in our class, it is the sympathetic division. And so, sympathetic division has these preganglionic neurons, and they come from the thoracic, mostly the thoracic part of our spine, and then a little bit of the lumbar. 12 and 2 are not important to you. Okay? But they're mostly coming from the thoracic region, and then it's just a little bit of the lumbar. Preganglionic neurons coming from the spinal cord, these here, are short. And so when they get to the sympathetic ganglion is right next to the spinal cord. Each sympathetic preganglionic axon may go to multiple postganglionic neurons. What that's saying is that one preganglionic neuron goes to a ganglion. But you might have as many as 20 postganglionic neurons coming out of that ganglion. So one signal comes from the spinal cord to the ganglion, but then it gets dispersed throughout the body to a number of different locations. That's going to allow the sympathetic nervous system to affect a whole bunch of different things. We said the sympathetic nervous system was the fight or flight mechanism, right? And there's a lot of different parts of our body that are going to respond to the fight or flight mechanism. And so that allows one command to control a whole bunch of different organs in our body if, when it gets here, the one signal gets here, and then it's going to split to a whole bunch of different organs. Yes, it is. When that preganglionic neuron gets to the ganglion, it can do one of four things. Okay? It can do multiple things, period. Good?
Thank God.
It has multiple options of what it can do after it reaches that ganglion. Don't worry about 1 through 4. So this is a picture of the sympathetic division. So we have spinal cord here. We get down to the thoracic region. And now we start to have these preganglionic neurons coming off. And then we also have the top view of the lumbar region. Notice they're coming off, and then these things here are the ganglion. And so they are literally lined up right on either side of the spinal cord. Once they go in there, though, then they have multiple options of what they can do. And so we're not going to go through all the options, but if you take a minute to look at where these lines go, once they get to that ganglion, you'll see that they have a whole bunch of options. So let's just look at this one. It comes into here. Once it gets there, it can go to here, it can go to there, it can go up a level, it can go down a level, it can actually turn around and go back to the spinal cord. There's lots of things that it can do. But primarily, they come out of the spinal cord into a ganglion, and then go off to an organ. That's the simplest, most common example. Parasympathetic division is also called the craniosacral division because it comes from the cranial region and the sacral region, which is the sacrum. So it's going to come from the very top and the very bottom of the spinal cord. Parasympathetic ganglia are called terminal ganglia, and like we said, they're next to what they're going to control. If you have a ganglia that's going to control the liver, or the lungs, that ganglion is going to be right next to the lungs. Which means there are long preganglionic neurons and short postganglionic neurons. So here, we have it coming from the cranial region, up here, and the sacrum, which is all the way at the bottom. Notice we don't have the ganglia lined up along the spinal cord. Instead, we have a very, very, very long neuron that goes to an entirely different part of the body. And then the ganglia are much closer to where you're going. And so the ganglia for the vagus nerve may be down here. It starts up here, the beginning of the neuron is up here, the end of the neuron is down here. And that is one cell. One neuron connects that whole way. Primary difference between sympathetic and parasympathetic in terms of organization is which one is long, which one is short. In the sympathetic, preganglionic is short, postganglionic is long. In parasympathetic, preganglionic is long, postganglionic is short. Yeah.
Faster response.
It doesn't really influence response time. They're both myelinated, and so it's like flying, if you're flying from here to Los Angeles, is it quicker to fly from here to Houston and Houston to Los Angeles, or from here to Denver and Denver to Los Angeles? If it's on the same route, it doesn't really matter. It just, if you have a connection much closer to the spinal cord, it allows you to then split and go a lot of different directions. If you have a layover in Houston, you can go a lot of places very quickly. But if you fly all the way to San Francisco and then have a layover there, you're probably going to California or the West Coast. The autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, are both going to have neurotransmitters, like we've talked about in the past. So the neurotransmitter, remember, is the chemical that goes across the synapse. It's going to carry information from one neuron to the next. In the past, we've only had acetylcholine. But in the autonomic nervous system, we actually have multiple different neurotransmitters. Some will have acetylcholine. Others will have norepinephrine. Norepinephrine is also called noradrenaline. These two neurotransmitters may excite some organs or inhibit others. It's complicated. Some neurons will use acetylcholine, some will use norepinephrine. All preganglionic neurons use acetylcholine. All. Whether they're sympathetic or parasympathetic. If it's a preganglionic neuron, it will use acetylcholine. Parasympathetic postganglionic neurons use acetylcholine. Some sympathetic postganglionic neurons use acetylcholine. But most sympathetic postganglionic neurons use norepinephrine, which is also noradrenaline, which can be abbreviated NE. So, preganglionic uses what? Acetylcholine. Postganglionic, in the parasympathetic, uses acetylcholine. The only exception is postganglionic in the sympathetic. They use norepinephrine. When the sympathetic division kicks in, most of its function is going to go through the adrenal gland. The adrenal gland has two parts. The adrenal medulla is the center part of the adrenal gland. And the adrenal glands are on the kidney. They actually are attached to the kidneys. Let me find the picture. And so what's going to happen is the adrenal glands are going to get activated. And the adrenal glands make hormones. Hormones go into the bloodstream and go throughout the entire body. So one nerve can connect to one gland, which can influence your entire body. So sitting right on top of your kidneys are your adrenal glands. So it's going to put us into fight or flight. What do you think is going to be affected in our body by turning on that fight or flight mechanism? Heart. What do you think your heart is going to do in response to fight or flight? Beat faster. Why?
The rush of adrenaline, the blood flow to
Look, right. Adrenaline is going to cause it to beat faster, and your heart is going to beat faster to get blood to parts of our body, so that we get oxygen and nutrients to parts of our body, so that we can, one, react quickly, and then also be strong and fast to get away or fight, whatever we're going to have to do. What else do you think is part of fight or flight?
The lungs.
I'll come back. Brain's more complicated. Brains is very complicated. So lungs. What do you think your lungs are going to do? You're going to breathe faster. When you get scared or startled, you have to catch your breath, right? You're breathing very, very fast. Because in that split instant, a command went from your brain to your adrenal gland, which secreted hormones, which got to your lungs. All that quickly. Okay? What else do you think can be controlled by fight or flight, other than brain?
your eyes, like your dilation.
Yep. It's hard to see in a person. If you have a cat, just go like that in their face. You don't have to scare them. Just go like that. Their eyes will just go like that. That's fight or flight. Why do you think that is? Why would your eyes, your pupils dilate like that? Let in more light. So you can really see what's going on. You'll also slightly increase your peripheral vision by having larger pupils. What else? Muscle. What about muscles, do you think? Tense. Why would your muscles tense? What would be the evolutionary purpose of your muscles tensing when you get scared?
To react faster, to build up, I don't know, potential energy.
It's like when a cat's ears stand up.
It's simple. So think about, if you watch sports, imagine football, okay? If somebody sees a hit coming, they tend to not get hurt. They tend to get hurt a lot more when they don't see a hit coming. Why?
They're prepared for it.
They're prepared for it.
Their muscles tend, yeah.
It makes it denser, so it's much harder. And also, when it does that, it prevents your joints from flexing as much. It's going to resist flexing. Imagine if I see I'm going to get hit in the leg, and I tense my leg muscle, it's going to help prevent my ankle from rolling. But if I don't see it coming, and my muscles are loose, it's just going to flop over. All right? What else? Skin, yes? Yes?
So your pretty much your overall like senses, your sight and your hearing.
Your sensors are going to get more intense because your brain is going to turn into high gear. Let's come back to skin. What about the skin? Sweat, yeah. Well, number one, why do you think you might sweat? What type of sweat? Remember we had two types of sweat glands. What type of sweat is, yeah.
Would it be this?
Sudoriferous is the broad term for all sweat glands. We have apocrine and merocrine. Which one is the smelly one? Apocrine. Which one do you think is stress sweat? Apocrine. Now, think back to old times. Evolutionarily, why would fight or flight cause you to stress sweat, do you think?
Can I take it?
Go for it.
Is it because of like pheromones and statins and
Exactly, yes. It's to communicate to the people around you that you're in danger, and so they're in danger also. What else? What happens when somebody gets really scared and somebody says, you need to go change?
Pee yourself.
Yeah. Number one and number two, right?
Oh.
We have to get really, really scared. That's the joke. So theoretically, it can happen. Why do you think? Why? There is truth to that. But why?
To deter whatever you're scared.
I guess then when your blankets are like makes you, I don't know,
Your outer muscles tense, or your inner muscles loosen.
yeah.
Receptive to
It makes you lighter. You run faster. Right?
Sure.
Let's come back to the skin. Okay? We're not finished with skin. It actually doesn't vasodilate. It vasoconstricts. Why do you think fight or flight would vasoconstrict, prevent blood from getting to your skin?
Because he's trying to keep all the blood to your like most important organs.
Yes. It's trying to keep blood in your skin is not going to help you run or fight off an attacker. And so get the blood into your internal organs and your muscles where you really need it. Also, if you're in danger, what's likely to happen to you?
You're gonna get hurt.
You're going to get wounded. And if your blood is in the core of your body, you're less likely to lose a lot of blood, right? You're more likely to get injured in an extremity than you are the main part of your body. And so if you get cut on the arm, you're going to bleed, but your body has already constricted the blood vessels going to your arm. And so you're not going to lose as much blood. Okay, let's stop here. We did finish the lecture, and so we'll do review on Thursday. How would you like to review? Does anybody have suggestions how you would like to review for this exam?
I like how
Going through the learning objectives and we went through the learning objectives and the study guide for the final exam. Just talk away
Can
through.
we go through those homeworks? Like the homeworks you give us?
We can go through some of it. I don't going through all of them would
I was
take
gonna say
forever.
that one more.
No.
No, but yes, we can definitely, well, we can kind of scroll through them and people can say, let's go.
Can we do like a review Kahoot?
So I'm thinking we're going to do that at some point this semester. The thing is putting those Kahoots together